Picture London in 1888. Now fill it with 4.5 million people crammed into a city designed for two. Add a river so thick with sewage that Parliament has had to close its windows in summer because the smell makes grown men retch. Add streets so dark in November that a man can walk 10 steps from a gas lamp and vanish completely, swallowed by a fog so dense it has its own colour. Not grey, not black, but something closer to yellow, something closer to smoke and coal, and the breath of a million fires burning all at once. Now close your eyes and step inside. This is the city at its peak and at its worst. The greatest imperial capital the world has ever seen, and one of the most dangerous, most unequal, most fascinating places a human being could have found themselves alive. In 1888, the British Empire covers roughly a quarter of the entire surface of the earth. Its wealth flows back through the port of London in ships so laden with cotton, spices, sugar, and silk that the docks groan under the weight of it. And yet, a half-mile from those docks, children sleep 6 to a bed in rooms with no glass in the windows. Men work 14 hours a day for wages that barely cover bread. Women take in laundry by candlelight until their fingers bleed, not because they choose to, but because there is simply no other way. This is London in full contradiction, grand and filthy, powerful and desperate, a city of opera houses and opium dens, of hansom cabs rattling past barefoot children, of gaslit drawing rooms where ladies play piano while, 4 streets over, someone dies of cholera in a tenement that has not seen sunlight in 30 years. Tonight, we are going to spend a full day here, not in a history book, not at a safe distance. We are going to sink into it, breathe it in, feel the cold of a November morning before the fires are lit. We are going to follow the city from the absolute darkness before dawn, through the long noise and labour of the day, all the way into the strange, uneasy hours after midnight, when London finally, reluctantly, settles towards something like sleep. You will walk through streets that Dickens walked. You will stand in markets where the hawkers start calling before 4 in the morning. You will step into the cramped kitchens of working families and the vast dining rooms of the wealthy, and notice just how thin the wall is between them. You will feel the particular exhaustion of a Victorian life, the bone-deep tiredness of people who worked with their bodies every hour of daylight, and sometimes long after, and throughout it all, something else is moving through this city in 1888, something the newspapers cannot quite name yet, a tension, an anxiety, a sense that the modern world has arrived faster than the human heart was ready for it. The railways have been running for 50 years now, but people still find them slightly miraculous and slightly wrong. The telegraph sends messages faster than a horse can gallop, and no one is entirely comfortable with that. Photography is stripping away privacy in ways that make respectable Victorians nervous. And in the East End, always the East End, something darker still is unfolding. Because 1888 is also the year of Jack the Ripper, the year a city that already feared its own shadows found itself with very good reason to. We will not linger there, but we will not look away either. Because to spend a day in Victorian London, honestly, is to understand that this city held genuine terror alongside genuine beauty. That the gas lamps that look so romantic to us now cast shadows that were deeply, practically frightening to the people who lived beneath them. But that is hours away yet. For now, it is night. The city has not quite gone to sleep, and it will not quite go to sleep, not entirely, not all at once, because one of the defining qualities of London in 1888 is that it never fully stops. Even in the coldest, darkest hours before dawn, something is always moving. A night watchman making his rounds, a baker sliding loaves into an oven that has been burning since midnight, a costermonger with his cart, heading toward Covent Garden Market before the better traders take the best spots. A factory girl walking home through streets she knows better than to trust. The city breathes in shifts. It dozes in layers. The wealthy sleep longest and latest, in houses thick with curtains and quiet. The poor sleep shortest, waking before the world is ready to wake, sleeping again when they can. And the city itself, the bricks and cobblestones and iron railings and churchyard walls, absorbs all of it, the snoring and the footsteps and the distant whistle of a constable on his beat, and holds it, the way old cities always hold the lives that move through them. So settle in. Let the fog come down. Let the gas lamps do what they can against the dark, which is not much, but it is something. We are going to spend a day in Victorian London. We are going to feel what it was like to be alive in one of the most remarkable and most terrible cities the world has ever produced, at the exact moment when it stood at the height of its strange, contradictory, magnificent, exhausting power. The year is 1888. The night is cold, and somewhere in the city below us, London is just beginning to stir. It begins around 4 in the morning, maybe 3:30 on a cold November night, when the darkness is at its most complete and the fog has settled so low it sits in the doorways like something living. The gas lamps are still burning. They burn all night because the lamplighters who lit them at dusk will not return to extinguish them until just before sunrise. But their light does almost nothing useful. It simply exists. A faint orange smear in the yellow murk, enough to tell you where the street is, not enough to tell you what is in it. And yet the city is already moving. The first sounds come before you can see anything. The hollow clop of hooves on wet cobblestone, slow and deliberate, a draught horse pulling a market cart up from the river, the grind of iron wheels in the gaps between stones, the particular sound of a wooden barrel rolling across a yard somewhere close, echoing off brick walls that still hold the cold of the night in them. These are not the sounds of a city waking. These are the sounds of a city that never quite finished sleeping, picking itself back up again, resuming the business it put down only briefly and reluctantly a few hours before. The men driving those carts left home before their families were awake. They have been loading and hauling since midnight or before, moving produce in from the market gardens south of the river, from the farms along the Thames Valley, from the train depots where goods arrived in the small hours on overnight freight from Birmingham, from Manchester, from Bristol. By the time a respectable household in Kensington sits down to breakfast, the bread on their table has already passed through a dozen pairs of hands in the dark. The sweepers are out. Boys, mostly, some of them barely 10 years old, armed with brooms wider than their own shoulders, working the crossings where foot traffic will be heaviest in a few hours' time. They sweep the horse dung and the straw and the mud and the nameless wet accumulation of a London night into piles at the curbside, because the middle classes cannot be expected to lift their hems over filth on the way to their offices. The sweepers will work for tips. A penny from a passing gentleman, if one is generous, if one notices the boy at all, which many will not. The police constables are still on their beats, as they have been since 10 o'clock the previous evening. They walk a fixed route, the same circuit every night, covering their patch every 15 or 20 minutes, their footsteps measured and deliberate, their dark lanterns casting a cold white beam across doorways and alleyways. In the wealthier streets, Mayfair, Belgravia, the broad avenues running north from Hyde Park, there is almost nothing to see. The grand terraced houses stand quiet behind their painted railings, their windows dark, their residents sealed away in sleep behind 3 inches of heavy curtain. A cat on a doorstep, a discarded cab ticket in the gutter. That is all. But walk east. Walk 15 minutes toward the river, toward Whitechapel and Stepney and Bermondsey. The same early morning hour, the same yellow fog, and a completely different world. Here the streets are already loud. Lodging house doors opening and closing as night workers head home and day workers head out. A woman at a window above a chandler's shop, tipping a basin of grey water into the street below without looking. Two men arguing in a doorway about money. Their voices low, but their faces tight with the particular exhaustion of people who have been poor long enough that anger lives just beneath everything. A baby crying behind a wall so thin you can hear every catch of breath. In these streets, the night has no real edge. There is no clean moment when darkness becomes morning. It simply shifts, gradually and grudgingly, from one kind of grey to another. The fog thins a little as the hours move towards 6. Not enough to see clearly, but enough that the shapes of buildings begin to resolve out of the murk, chimney pots and roof lines appearing overhead, as if being assembled slowly, brick by brick, while you stand there watching. And then the smell changes. On top of the horse dung and the coal smoke, and the river damp, and the accumulated human closeness of too many people in too little space, on top of all of that, something else arrives. Bread. Baking bread, rising up from the bakeries that have been running their ovens since 2 in the morning, drifting along the cold air in a wave of warmth so incongruously kind that it seems almost wrong against the rest of it. A small mercy. A reminder that inside all this stone and fog and exhaustion and poverty, there are fires burning, and they are producing something worth having. The city is waking up, not all at once, not cleanly, but steadily, and with the unstoppable momentum of 4.5 million lives that have no choice in the matter. The day is beginning, whether London is ready or not. Inside the houses, it begins before anyone opens their eyes. The fires go first. In a wealthy townhouse in Mayfair or Belgravia, a housemaid, sometimes as young as 14, sometimes younger, has been awake since 5, or close to it. She crept down the back stairs in the dark in her working dress, careful not to make a sound on the steps. Not because she was told to be quiet, but because silence is simply the condition of her existence in this house. She carries the ash bucket and the blacking brush and the coal scuttle. She kneels at the grate in the dining room, or the morning room, or the master's study, and she begins, raking out the cold ash from the previous evening, laying fresh paper and wood, building the coal up over it in the particular arrangement she has been taught, the one that catches properly without needing to be relit. And then the match. A brief flare of light in the dark room, and slowly, haltingly, warmth begins again. By the time the family wakes, the fires have been burning for an hour. They do not know this. They do not think about it. They simply find the rooms warm, the way the rooms are always warm, and they dress. Further upstairs, in the best bedroom, the master of the house sleeps in a bed that would strike most people in London as nearly incomprehensible in its comfort. A mahogany frame, a horsehair mattress, or if the family is particularly well placed, a spring mattress from one of the new manufacturers. Linen sheets, laundered and pressed every week by someone else's hands. Heavy curtains blocking the grey morning light. A washstand in the corner with a china basin and a jug of clean water. Warm water, brought up by the maid who has already been downstairs for an hour feeding the fires. A chamber pot beneath the bed, emptied and cleaned daily, its existence acknowledged by no one and discussed by even fewer. There is a water closet somewhere in the house. Modern houses have them, fitted in the 1870s or thereabouts. But the chamber pot remains because the water closet is down a hallway and it is cold. This is what wealth buys in 1888. Not magic, not the future, simply distance. Distance from cold, from effort, from the smell and weight and physical difficulty of keeping a body alive and clean. The wealthy are insulated from all of it by a layer of other people who absorb the unpleasantness on their behalf, invisibly in the dark, before anyone important is awake. Now move east again. In a respectable middle-class home in Islington or Hackney, a draper's family perhaps, or a clerk's, the morning looks recognisable but considerably thinner. There may be one servant, a single general maid who does everything. The fires are still laid and lit before the family descends, but the washstand water is not always warm, and the bed is a wooden frame with a flock mattress that compresses over time into something approaching a shallow depression in a sack of wool. It is not uncomfortable by any standard the family would admit to, but it is not the horsehair of Mayfair. The children share rooms, the older boys share a bed. Washing happens at the basin on the landing, with cold water in a ewer, and the chamber pot under the bed is a plain white thing, with no illusions about itself. The husband dresses quickly because the bedroom is cold. The fire has only been lit in the parlour and the kitchen. He pulls on his collar and his cuffs, the outer parts of respectability, the parts that show, over yesterday's shirt, because the shirt is acceptable for another day and the laundry is expensive. His wife deals with the children. The children are told to wash their faces and hands and to be quick about it. Whether they do this thoroughly is a matter of maternal vigilance and available water in roughly equal measure. Respectability, here, is a performance mounted on a cold stage with limited props. The family is not poor. They are at great pains to ensure everyone knows they are not poor. But the gap between what they appear to be and what their mornings actually contain is wider than it looks from the street. And then there is the other London. In the lodging houses of Whitechapel and Spitalfields, the common lodging houses, the places where you pay 4p for a bed and 3p for a kitchen chair, the morning is something else entirely. The beds are not beds in any meaningful sense that the Mayfair household would recognise. They are wooden bunks stacked in rows, sometimes 3 high, covered with straw mattresses that have been slept on by hundreds of bodies before yours and will be slept on by hundreds after. The blankets are communal. The room holds perhaps 30 people, sometimes more. The smell in the morning, the concentrated smell of 30 unwashed bodies and inadequate ventilation, is the first thing that greets you when you open your eyes. There is no washstand. There is a tap in the yard if you want to wash, and in November the water from that tap is cold enough to hurt. Many do not use it. They cannot afford to be wet and cold, because wet and cold leads to chest sickness, and chest sickness leads to the infirmary, and the infirmary leads to nothing good. Washing is a luxury that competes, in a very direct calculation, with staying warm. The body is washed when circumstances permit, which is not often. The children in these houses have a particular quality to them, a watchfulness. They dress quickly and entirely because they have learned that possessions left unattended are possessions that disappear. The smaller children are bundled into whatever layers exist, not matched sets of children's clothing from a draper's catalogue, but assembled pieces. A man's cut-down waistcoat, a woman's shawl wrapped twice around small shoulders and pinned. The chamber pot, if there is one, is shared by the whole floor. More often, it is a bucket. It is emptied into the yard or the street, depending on the hour and the convenience, contributing its small portion to the general condition of the gutters below. What these people face at the start of the day is not simply inconvenience. It is the accumulated physical weight of a life lived with no margin, cold that cannot be escaped, hunger that has been waiting since the night before, the absolute absence of anything soft or private or warm by default. Every small comfort in this London, a cup of hot tea, a dry pair of stockings, a place to sit that is not also someone else's place, has to be actively obtained at some cost, against some obstacle. Privacy is perhaps the strangest loss. In the wealthy house, privacy is so abundant it barely registers. You have rooms. You have doors that close. You have a bedroom that belongs to you and no one enters without permission. In the crowded lodging houses, In the back courts, where whole families occupy a single room, privacy is simply not a category that applies. You dress in front of other people. You sleep in front of other people. The most intimate functions of the body are performed with the thinnest possible separation between yourself and every other person in your building. A sheet hung across a corner, a turned back, that is all. And yet the morning happens. The city fills up from the inside out, each household contributing its people to the streets, the wealthy later and better provisioned, the poor earlier and carrying everything they need for the day, because there is nothing worth leaving behind. The servant returns upstairs to make the beds she will never sleep in. The clerk buttons his collar against his clean-shaven face and checks his hat in the hallway mirror. The labourer wraps his hands against the cold and steps out into the November morning without looking back, all of them heading in their different ways toward the same city, all of them waking into the same grey light. The distance between their mornings is enormous. The streets they share are identical. The fires are burning. The people are dressed after a fashion, or in the process of becoming so. And now comes the first meal of the day, which in 1888 is a more complicated and revealing affair than it might appear. In the Mayfair townhouse, breakfast is a production, not a grand one by the standards of the evening meal, but a production nonetheless. The dining room is warm. The maid saw to that an hour ago, and the table has been laid with a white cloth, with silver that was polished last Tuesday, with cups and saucers that are thin enough to see light through if you hold them up, which no one at this table would think to do, because you only notice the quality of your china if you are not accustomed to having it. The sideboard holds the morning's offerings in covered dishes, kept warm over small spirit lamps, kidneys perhaps, grilled in butter, bacon, thick cut, kippers, their particular dense, smoky smell filling the room in a way that the family has long since stopped perceiving as remarkable. Kedgeree on a Thursday perhaps, a remnant of the previous evening's fish, transformed by rice and hard-boiled eggs, and a careful hand with the curry powder into something that feels like a considered choice rather than an economy. There are eggs. There is always toast in a silver rack, already going slightly cold, because toast in a silver rack is the natural condition of toast in a wealthy Victorian household. Produced in the kitchen below, carried upstairs, and arriving at the table at a temperature that suggests the journey was slightly longer than ideal, but no one says so. There is marmalade. There is butter. There is a pot of tea so large it requires 2 hands and produces enough for 5 cups apiece. The master of the house reads the Times. This is not a negotiable feature of the morning. The Times arrives before 8, or it should, and if it does not, there is the kind of quiet dissatisfaction that radiates through a household without ever being stated directly. He reads. His wife pours. The children, if they are old enough to eat at the family table and young enough not to have been sent away to school, are required to sit without slouching and to speak when spoken to, which is less often than they might like. The governess eats separately, in a room that is neither the dining room nor the kitchen, in that particular Victorian limbo reserved for people of uncertain status, educated enough not to eat with the servants, employed enough not to eat with the family. She has toast and tea and a boiled egg, and she eats it alone and reads, if she has a book, or simply sits with her thoughts, if she does not. Below stairs, the cook and the remaining servants have their own breakfast. It is substantial. The cook ensures this, partly from professional pride, and partly because the food that circulates in a kitchen of this kind includes offcuts and remainders that would otherwise be discarded, and a well-fed kitchen is a well-run kitchen, or so the logic runs. They eat together at the kitchen table with a familiarity that the dining room above would find startling, because the hierarchy of the servants' hall, though real and carefully maintained, is a different kind of hierarchy. Warmer, louder, less corseted. Now move the morning down several rungs. In the middle-class house in Islington, the one servant, the general maid, the girl who does everything, has put the kettle on and laid the kitchen table because the family does not keep a dining room fire before 8:30 and the kitchen is warm. Breakfast here is tea, strong and dark, poured into cups without saucers on a weekday. Bread, yesterday's loaf, cut thick and spread with dripping if the household is economical, with butter if they are feeling prosperous, or if there is company expected. Perhaps a bloater, a salt-cured herring, cheaper than a kipper, with a particular aggressive flavour that either comforts or repels, depending on how long you have been eating them. Oatmeal porridge for the children, made on the range in a pot that has been soaking since the night before, stirred with a patience that the morning does not always make easy, served with a little salt because sugar is a luxury calibrated by the spoonful. The mother eats standing, or almost. She supervises the children and the porridge and the whereabouts of the bread knife simultaneously. The father eats quickly, checks his pocket watch, a silver one, kept in good order, one of the few objects in this house with no purely functional purpose, and is out the door before the children have finished. He does not say goodbye in any ceremonial sense. He says he is going. The door closes. The house exhales. The clothing that has been assembled during all of this is worth pausing over, because dressing in 1888 is not a simple act. It is, for anyone with any claim to respectability, a layered and sequential project that involves more separate pieces of clothing than the modern mind easily imagines. A woman of the middle class, getting dressed in the morning, begins with her chemise and her drawers. Over these goes the corset, which must be laced, ideally by another person, though in a household of one servant this is a negotiation, tight enough to produce the silhouette that the decade requires, the narrow waist, the particular carriage of the upper body that reads as controlled, composed, feminine in the precise Victorian sense. Over the corset goes the corset cover to protect the dress from the boning. Then the petticoats, 1 or 2 or 3, depending on the season and the occasion. Then the bustle, if she wears one. Fashions are shifting in 1888, the exaggerated shelf of the early 80s contracting into something more moderate, but it is still there, a small architecture of wire and fabric worn at the back of the skirt. Then the blouse, then the skirt, then the jacket, buttoned up the front, each button a small decision. Then the hair, which does not arrange itself. The hair takes time. In a wealthy household, there is a lady's maid for this, a woman whose specific skill is pinning and curling and arranging hair into the elaborate upswept styles of the period, using pads and pins and heated tongs that smell faintly of scorched metal. In a middle-class household, the woman does her own hair with the same pads and pins and tongs by a mirror in a cold room, her arms aching by the time she is finished. The end result is similar. The effort is entirely her own. A man's morning is quicker, but no less considered in its symbols. The collar is the thing. A high white collar, starched stiff, fastened with a stud at the back. This is the visible mark of the man who does not work with his hands. A labourer does not wear a collar like this because a collar like this would not survive an hour of physical labour. The clerk, the draper, the teacher, the solicitor. These men wear their collars the way knights once wore their insignia. It is costume as declaration. I belong to this class and not that one. I sit at a desk. My hands stay clean. The collar proves it. And then there is the other breakfast, or the thing that substitutes for it, in the streets of Whitechapel and Southwark and the Borough. A cup of tea from a street stall, a halfpenny. Sometimes a penny if you want it with milk, which you probably do because milk makes it larger and the larger thing is warmer and you are cold. The stalls are there before 6, managed by women who have been up since 4, pouring from great urns into chipped cups that are handed back and washed in a bucket and handed out again. Beside them, sometimes, a cellar of bread, thick slices, a farthing each, or a penny for a whole roll, or a barrow of hot potatoes baked in their skins that will hold the heat in your hands for 20 minutes, which is its own form of value on a cold morning. The very poorest eat whatever they have, which may be nothing, cold tea from last night, if they are lucky enough to have had tea last night. A piece of bread saved deliberately, held back from hunger with a discipline that has no name in this language, but deserves one. The children in these streets know hunger not as an emergency, but as a background condition, the way middle-class children know mild cold, persistent, expected, managed around, not quite overcome. What breakfast reveals across all of these households is the same thing that the morning has been revealing all along. This city contains multitudes not merely in number, but in the texture of daily life, in the weight and flavour of each ordinary hour, the kippers and the kedgeree, the bloater and the dripping, the halfpenny tea and the empty morning that comes before it. These are not simply meals, they are the specific gravity of each life, measured in what can be eaten without thinking, and what must be thought about to eat at all. And so, the city moves, not all at once, and not in any single direction, but with the particular density of 4.5 million lives tilting simultaneously toward their obligations. The morning has been lit and dressed and fed in all its gradations. Now it must be transported. Begin with the ones who walk, because most people walk. In 1888, the feet are still the primary engine of human movement across London, and the streets reflect this with a relentlessness that the modern mind struggles to fully inhabit. The factory hand from Bermondsey sets out before 6, sometimes before 5, because the factory gates close when the factory gates close, and there is no conversation to be had on the subject. He walks a mile, perhaps 2, in boots that are either his own or someone else's, through streets that are still dark and already filling. He does not think of this as a commute in the sense that the word will eventually acquire. He thinks of it as walking to work, which is simply what you do before work. The walk is not the problem. The cold is sometimes the problem. The wet is often the problem. The dark, at this hour, in these streets, with the gas lamps throwing their limited amber circles onto cobblestones, slick with last night's rain and other things besides. The dark is always a negotiation. The clerk from Clerkenwell, the one with the collar, the one whose breakfast was bread and dripping and whose pocket watch is a source of quiet, maintained pride. He walks too, for part of it. But he is also the kind of man who has recently discovered, and rather admires, the omnibus. The horse omnibus is London in motion, and it is not comfortable, and it does not pretend to be. These are large vehicles, double-decked, drawn by 2 horses and carrying as many passengers as can be convinced to fit, which is consistently more than is strictly advisable. Inside, on the lower deck, the seats run along the sides and face inward, knees touching the knees of strangers, the smell of damp wool and pipe smoke and horse traffic accumulated through the morning thick in the air. Outside, on the top deck, there are no sides to speak of and no protection from the weather, and you sit on a bench and hold your hat against the wind and look down at the street moving beneath you and feel, despite everything, a mild and slightly irrational satisfaction at the view. The horse omnibus routes are fixed. The fares are pennies, specific pennies for specific distances, and conductors manage this with a speed and certainty that suggests long practice and a complete absence of sentimentality. The clerk knows his route. He knows which stop to board and approximately how long the journey takes, and which fellow passengers he sees often enough to recognise by hat and coat without ever learning their names. There is a specific quiet fellowship in this, the daily proximity of strangers moving through the same slice of city, none of whom will speak to each other, but all of whom share a faint, unspoken understanding of the particular nature of the 7:45 from Farringdon Road. The hansom cab exists for those who can pay more and need to arrive faster, or simply for those who require the performance of arriving by hansom cab, which is its own form of information. These are the two-wheeled vehicles you have seen in illustrations, the driver perched high at the back, the horse quick, and the interior just large enough for two people to sit with their knees touching, rather than their neighbours. The city has 11,000 licensed cabs moving through its streets in 1888. 11,000, rattling over cobblestones, their iron wheels producing a continuous percussion that Londoners born into the noise no longer consciously hear, but that visitors describe as physically exhausting within the hour. The cab driver knows every shortcut and has opinions about all of them and will share those opinions if given the opportunity. He is not given the opportunity often. Then there is the railway, and the railway changes everything. The underground lines, Metropolitan, District, and their connections are already threaded beneath the city by 1888 dark and smoky tunnels, through which steam engines pull carriages of clerks and shopgirls and civil servants from the outer districts into the centre with a speed that walking cannot match and a discomfort that is, perhaps, proportionate. The underground is not pleasant. The smoke from the engines fills the tunnels and the carriages and coats the inside of the windows with a film of soot through which the stations pass like watercolour suggestions. The air is thick with the specific flavour of coal and condensation and many people in a confined space. But it is fast. And in London, in 1888, fast matters, because London has spread so far beyond its original boundaries that the ordinary business of getting from where you live to where you work has become an exercise in logistics that previous generations would have found extraordinary. The commute, as a concept, is new enough to still feel slightly strange. Men who grew up in the city their fathers knew, compact, dense, where a man might live 2 streets from his trade, are now making journeys of 5 or 6 miles each morning, riding the train in from Peckham or Tottenham or Acton in communities of other men doing the same, all of them reading newspapers or staring at the middle distance or conducting the particular interior solitude that long daily journeys produce in the human mind. The city is growing outward faster than it is growing inward, and the railways are the reason, and every morning this shows itself in the faces pressed against the carriage windows. On the river, the steamboats are running. The Thames is a working highway, choked with traffic of a kind that the water itself can barely sustain. Coal barges and cargo ships and passenger ferries crossing and recrossing. The dock workers already an hour into their shifts at Wapping and Rotherhithe, loading and unloading in the cold with the practiced efficiency of men whose bodies have learned to do this, while their minds are somewhere quieter. The river in morning fog is a particular thing. Masts emerging from grey, the sound of a bell from somewhere out in the channel, the smell of the water and the coal smoke blended into something that is London's own. Unmistakable, not quite unpleasant if you have been breathing it your whole life. The streets, across all of this, are dense with hazards that the city has simply accepted as the terms of its own existence. The horse traffic alone, carriages, carts, omnibuses, hansom cabs, delivery wagons, the enormous dray horses pulling barrels of beer through streets not originally designed for the volumes they now carry, produces a surface condition on the London cobblestone that requires constant management. There are crossing sweepers at the major junctions, often children, clearing a path through the horse dung with brooms in exchange for whatever coin a grateful pedestrian might provide. This is both a service and a commentary on the city's relationship with its own infrastructure. London in 1888 is a city that has grown too fast for the systems designed to run it. And the gap between what is needed and what exists is visible at every crossing, every junction, every street where the traffic has locked, and the horses are unhappy, and the drivers are saying things that the ladies on the pavement are choosing to consider inaudible. To walk in this city on a working morning is to feel, at every moment, the weight of its becoming. The costermonger has had her barrow out since 5, already down the length of Whitechapel Road and back, her voice carrying the particular pitch that carries over street noise without effort, learned not in any classroom but simply from years of standing in the sound of the city and projecting through it. The delivery boy on his bicycle, new enough to the street to still turn heads, weaves between a coal cart and a brougham with the confidence of someone who has made this calculation 100 times and arrived unscathed each time so far. The maid from the Pimlico townhouse, sent out for a message before 9, steps around a pile of oyster shells outside a public house and keeps her eyes forward because eye contact on the street is a negotiation she has no time for this morning. All of them moving, all of them part of this vast and unremarkable daily migration. Unremarkable because it happens every morning, because the city requires it and so it occurs, because London in 1888 does not wait for anyone to be ready. It opens its mouth and breathes in, and 4.5 million people lean forward into their day. And then the gates close. This is the first fact of work in 1888, and it is the fact that organises everything else. The factory gates close at 6, or past, or 7, depending on the trade, depending on the owner, depending on the season and the light, and the 100 small negotiations between industry and the human body that Victorian London has largely settled in favour of industry. And once those gates are closed, you are either inside them or you are not. And if you are not, you may find yourself without wages for the day, which is not a philosophical problem. It is a dinner problem. It is a rent problem. It is the specific and immediate arithmetic of precarious existence in a city that does not soften this arithmetic for anyone who cannot afford to have it softened. Inside the factories, time is the architecture. The clock on the wall, and there is always a clock on the wall, because industrialization is, above all else, a reorganization of time, marks the hours with an authority that the church bell once held, but now shares reluctantly. Before the factory system, time was elastic. A craftsman working in his own home, at his own bench, could let the morning stretch or compress according to the light, the weather, the work itself. That world has not entirely disappeared from London in 1888, but it is shrinking, and the factories are what is replacing it. Inside these buildings, the printing works of Fleet Street, the match factories of Bow, the leather-working sheds of Bermondsey, the great riverside engine shops of Millwall, time has been cut into portions, and each portion assigned a value, and the value is not large. A factory hand in 1888 might earn 12 shillings a week, perhaps 14 if the trade is skilled and the hands are scarce. A woman in the same factory, doing work that requires equal patience and finer fingers, will earn 7. This is not a secret that anyone is hiding. It is simply the arrangement, and the arrangement is so thoroughly established that it barely requires justification. She stands at her bench for 10 hours, sometimes 12, in a room lit by windows that were designed to admit light rather than air, and the noise of the machinery is a continuous vibration she has stopped consciously hearing, but that lives in her joints by evening. Her hands know the work without her having to think about it, which is both the efficiency the factory requires and the small private mercy that makes it survivable. The docks tell a different story, and it is a harder one. At Wapping, at Rotherhithe, at the great enclosed docks of the Isle of Dogs, the daily hiring is a ritual of organised uncertainty that breaks men in ways that factories, for all their discipline, do not quite manage. Every morning, several hundred men gather at the dock gates before 6, before 5, before any reasonable hour, and wait to see how many will be taken on. The foremen move through the crowd and point, you, and you, and those selected have work. Those not selected do not, and must return tomorrow, and the day after, and stand again in the same crowd of the same men, with the same hungry arithmetic pressing on all of them equally. This is casual labour, and casual labour is the great unacknowledged engine of Victorian London's port economy. The ships must be unloaded by hands that do not require the expense of permanent wages. And so the system exists, and the men exist within it, and the precariousness is the point rather than a flaw. When you are inside, the work is enormous. Sacks of grain that weigh a man's own weight, hoisted and carried and stacked in the dim interiors of warehouses that smell of 100 different cargoes. Tea, coffee, wool, hides, sugar, all of it moving through hands that will earn 4p an hour and finish the day too exhausted for conversation, but not, quite, too exhausted for a pint at the pub by the water, because there are expenditures that exhaustion does not eliminate. The workshops are something else again, and London in 1888 is still a city of workshops. The great tailoring trade of the East End operates through a chain of small, cramped rooms where a master cutter takes in work from the merchant houses of the West End and distributes it through a network of workers whose existence the fashionable customer, ordering his evening coat on Savile Row, need never contemplate. A garment might pass through 4 or 5 pairs of hands in 4 or 5 different rooms before it is finished. Each pair of hands is paid by the piece. Each room smells of coal and chalk, and the particular staleness of occupied space, where the windows are rarely opened because the draught ruins the work. Children help their mothers with the finishing, drawing threads, pressing seams, not yet officially in the workforce, simply present in the room where the work is done, which amounts to the same thing by dark. The offices of the city are a different country entirely. Here the clerk sits at his high desk, and it is still, in many establishments, a high desk with a high stool, the posture slightly ecclesiastical, slightly penitential, and copies letters and figures with a penmanship that his employer assesses without quite acknowledging, the way one assesses all things that are expected without being exceptional. The hours are long, but the conditions are dry, and the work does not take the body apart in the same increments that the docks do. What it takes, instead, is something harder to name. A kind of daily submission to smallness, to the careful execution of tasks that are significant to the business and invisible to history, performed by a man who has a collar and a watch, and a certain maintenance of dignity that is itself a form of labour. Respectability has its own exhaustions. The domestic servant in the Belgravia townhouse rises at 5:30 and is last to her bed at 11, and the hours between are an unbroken catalogue of requirement. She carries coal, she carries water, she carries trays and messages, and the silent obligation of a near invisibility, because the well-run household is one in which the machinery of comfort functions without the machinery becoming apparent to those it serves. There are 300,000 domestic servants in London in 1888, more than any single industry employs, and the majority of them are women, and the majority of those women are young, and the work defines the shape of their days with a completeness that the factory worker, who at least finishes at a specific hour, might find difficult to fully imagine. The servant does not finish. She pauses. There is a difference. And running beneath all of it, the question of what industrialization has actually done to the human relationship with time. A generation before, a man's day moved with the light and the season, with the rhythm of the work itself, which had its own internal logic of beginning and completion. Now the clock imposes its external structure on the body's older rhythms, and the body, over time, yields. The factory hand does not need to think about when to start. The gate tells him. The whistle tells him. The foreman tells him. The work tells him when to stop by simply continuing past the point at which he would, left to himself, have chosen to stop. This is not experienced as oppression in any vocabulary available to most of the men and women living it. It is experienced as Tuesday, as the smell of the works, as the weight in the shoulders by 4 o'clock, as the sound of the whistle at 6 that means the day is complete and the evening is briefly, incompletely, his own. The wages go home, some of them. The rent is paid first, then the food, and if there is anything left after the food and the rent and the coal and the mending of the boots, it exists in small coins at the bottom of a pocket, and decisions are made about it that are more complex and more human than the ledgers of the factory owners will ever reflect. London, in 1888, does not stop to consider this. It is already moving toward the afternoon, and the afternoon moves through markets. This is something you need to understand about London in 1888, that commerce is not contained in shops, not tidily shelved behind glass, not organised into the clean retail transactions that a later century will come to expect. Commerce is everywhere. It is on the pavement and in the gutter and in the narrow gaps between buildings where a man has set up a barrow because that particular gap catches the foot traffic from 2 streets at once, and he has learned this through the slow empirical study of where people walk when they are hungry and in a hurry. The city sells things to itself continuously, in every direction, at every hour, with a noise and a press and a particular human energy that is exhausting to witness, and somehow, despite everything, alive. Start at the edge of the morning, when Covent Garden has already been in motion for 3 hours before most of the city has opened its eyes. The wholesale market runs on a timetable that is entirely its own. Carts arriving from the market gardens of Surrey and Kent before dawn. Mountains of cabbages and onions and late autumn root vegetables piled with a casual extravagance that suggests abundance, but is really just the arithmetic of a city that requires feeding 4.5 million times a day. By the time the housewives and the cooks and the barrow boys arrive to buy their portions of this abundance, the wholesale transactions are already complete, and the price of a bundle of leeks has already been determined by negotiations conducted in the dark by men who do not use their indoor voices. The street markets come alive by mid-morning and do not quieten until the light fails. Petticoat Lane, which is properly called Middlesex Street, but nobody calls it that, stretches on a Sunday with a density of human commerce that makes it almost impossible to move through without buying something, which is, of course, the point. But on ordinary weekday mornings, the weekday markets of Whitechapel Road, of Leather Lane, of Chapel Street in Islington, of the Caledonian Road, these are the arteries through which ordinary Londoners circulate their pennies in exchange for the necessities of ordinary life. A woman with a basket on her arm and a specific sum in her head moves along these stalls with an expertise that the casual observer might mistake for indecision, but is actually a sophisticated running calculation. The quality of this potato against the price of that one. The freshness of this fish against the distance still to walk. The marginal mathematics of feeding a family on 14 shillings a week becoming second nature after enough weeks of practice. The vendors do not wait quietly for custom. This is the other thing. The cries of the street sellers are a composition. Not musical exactly, but organised in the way that a crowd has organisation, with rhythms and patterns that the ear learns even when the mind does not consciously notice. A fishmonger who is good at his trade has a cry that carries 3 streets in damp air and that manages to communicate both the freshness of his herrings and a certain genial urgency, the implication that these herrings are going quickly and that you, specifically, would regret arriving late. The woman selling watercress, from a flat basket balanced on her head, has a voice that has been doing this since childhood and has the particular carrying quality of something trained by necessity rather than instruction. The knife grinder announces himself with a bell. The muffin man, in the later afternoon, rings his own. The city is full of these small sonic signatures, each one a form of advertisement in a world that has not yet separated advertising from the human voice that delivers it. What ordinary Londoners buy each day is, at its core, a very short list. Bread, which is the foundation on which everything else rests, and which a family in Bethnal Green will consume in quantities that seem extraordinary only if you have not considered how much of their caloric architecture it is required to carry. Potatoes, coal for the fire, sold in small quantities by the sack because there is not room to store it in larger quantities, and not money to buy it in larger quantities, even if there were. Tea, which by 1888 has worked its way so deeply into the fabric of working-class life that it functions less as a luxury than as a psychological load-bearing structure. The cup of tea that is made in the morning, and the cup of tea that is made when things go wrong, and the cup of tea that marks the end of something and the beginning of something else. A small quantity of bacon, perhaps, a herring, cheese when the budget extends to it, and the small top-up purchases that a day requires, a penn'orth of this, a ha'porth of that, the incremental negotiations with scarcity that constitute the domestic economy of the working poor. But London in 1888 is also the capital of something else, and you feel it when you cross certain streets. Oxford Street in the afternoon is a different world from Petticoat Lane, and the difference is not merely one of degree, but of kind. Here the great drapery houses, Marshall and Snellgrove, Peter Robinson, the expanding empire of William Whiteley, who has declared himself the universal provider and is not, by London standards, vastly overstating the case, offer a consumer experience that is itself a form of entertainment. The plate glass windows are a recent development, and they are doing something to the city that nobody has quite articulated yet, which is that they are creating a relationship between the person on the pavement and the goods on display that is not quite commerce and not quite desire, but something that contains both. A woman who cannot afford what is in the window may stand at the window regardless. The display is free. The looking is free. What it costs is harder to measure. Inside these establishments, the shop assistants, young women mostly, living in the dormitories above the shop at the employer's insistence and the employer's convenience, are performing a kind of theatre of respectability that suits the customers they are serving. They speak carefully. They fold things carefully. They have been instructed in the particular deference that makes a customer feel that purchasing a length of silk poplin is a decision of some gravity, which it is, though not for the reasons the atmosphere implies. Elsewhere, the second-hand trade conducts its own parallel economy with rather less theatre and rather more practicality. The rag-and-bone man moves through streets collecting what other streets have discarded, and what he collects passes through several more pairs of hands before it finds its final form. The coat that came off a wealthy back in Mayfair, appearing some months later on a barrow in Bermondsey, priced according to what the market will bear, which is always less than it was worth at the beginning, but always more than nothing. Nothing is wasted in 1888 that can be converted into pennies. This is not a philosophy. It is a structural feature of the economy. The question of what you are actually buying when you buy food in 1888 is not one that everyone can answer with confidence. Adulteration is the word, and it covers a range of practices that run from the merely disappointing to the actively dangerous. Chalk in the flour, water in the milk, sometimes worse than water, since the water available for the adulterating is not always the water you would choose to drink. Alum in the bread to make it whiter, because white bread signals something to working-class customers that it also signals to wealthy ones, which is that it is not the coarse brown article eaten by people who cannot do better. Plaster of Paris in the sugar. Copper salts added to pickles to restore a green that spoilage has dulled. The Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875 was intended to address some of this, and it has addressed some of it, in the sense that the most egregious adulterations are now technically illegal and practically ongoing, because inspection is occasional and prosecution is inconvenient and profit is continuous. The woman with her basket on her arm has learned some of this through experience. She knows which stalls she trusts and which ones require a skeptical eye. She rubs the bread between her fingers to feel for grit. She smells the butter before she pays for it. She is a practical analyst of her own food supply in ways that the food itself should not require, but does. And so the market day concludes its business in the thickening afternoon light, the vendors beginning to reduce their prices as the hour grows late, and the unsold goods grow less sellable, and the city absorbing the transactions of the day into the larger, quieter metabolism of its evenings. The baskets go home. The fires are lit. The arithmetic is briefly resolved. Cross Whitechapel Road heading east and something shifts. It is not dramatic exactly. There is no gate, no wall, no moment at which a sign announces that you are leaving one London and entering another. But the shift is real, and the body registers it before the mind does, in the narrowing of the streets, in the way the light changes quality as the buildings close in from either side, in the particular texture of a crowd that has nowhere else to go and has organized its entire life, its entire economy, its entire interior world, into the space that is available, which is not very much space at all. This is the East End in 1888, and in 1888, almost no part of London is more talked about by people who do not live there, or less understood by them. Begin with the lodging houses, because the lodging houses are where you understand something fundamental about what poverty actually is in this city. The common lodging house, the doss house in the vocabulary of the streets, charges 4p a night for a bed, which is not a bed in any domestic sense, but a narrow wooden bunk in a room that contains between 20 and 60 other narrow wooden bunks, each one occupied by a person whose primary shared characteristic with their neighbours is that they have 4p and not 8p, because 8p would secure something marginally better, and 4p is what they have. The rooms smell of bodies and damp clothing, and the particular sourness of people who have been working very hard in very cold air and have no means of washing the day off themselves before they sleep. The walls sweat. The windows, where they exist, do not open because they were not built to open, and because the man who runs the lodging house has calculated that ventilation is not a selling point at 4p a night. And yet these places are also social, strangely, persistently social. The kitchen in a common lodging house. There is always a kitchen, a large room with a range where residents can cook if they have something to cook. Functions as something between a sitting room and a street corner. Men and women crowd around it in the evenings, warming themselves against the iron, sharing food when sharing is possible, exchanging information about where there is work tomorrow, and which foreman is hiring, and which street is to be avoided for reasons that the evening newspapers will sensationalize, and that the people in this room understand as the ordinary texture of risk that attaches to living here. There is talk, there is occasional laughter, there is the particular human density that comes from people who have nothing finding that the nothing is at least shared. Outside the lodging houses, in the narrow courts that run between and behind the main streets, Bear Alley, Fashion Street, Flower and Dean Street, names that have an almost deliberate incongruity. The courts conduct their own quiet life. These are the warrens that the sanitary reformers visit and go away from writing articles in careful, horrified language about the impossibility of improvement. They are right about the impossibility in one sense. A court that is 8 feet wide between buildings that rise 3 stories on either side receives approximately 45 minutes of direct sunlight on a summer afternoon and none whatsoever in November. A water pump serves the whole court, when it works. A privy serves the whole court in a different way. The ground is always damp, and the livelihoods that sustain the people in these courts are the most fragile the city produces. The word for it is casual, and it is a word that contains a brutality inside its ordinariness. Casual labour means that you do not have a job in any stable sense of the word. You have the possibility of a job on any given morning, and what you do is present yourself at the dock gates, or at the building sites, or at the warehouse loading bays before 6 in the morning, and you wait with the other men who are also waiting. And a foreman looks at the assembled waiting men and selects some of them based on criteria that are partly about physical capacity and partly about whether your face is known and partly about chance. And the men he selects work that day, and the men he does not select do not. There is no recourse. There is no appeal. There is only tomorrow morning, when the same theatre repeats itself, when you stand again at the gate with the same hope arranged again into the same expression of capable willingness, because showing desperation does not help, and everybody knows it. A man who works 3 days out of 5 considers himself to be doing reasonably well. What keeps people alive when the labour does not materialise is a complicated, overlapping infrastructure of small reliefs that is not a system because it was not designed and is not reliable, but that functions imperfectly as one. There are the Board of Guardians and the workhouse at the end of the most severe roads, which people will accept as a last resort and not before, because the workhouse requires something in return for its relief that is understood to be more than food and shelter. There are the charitable organisations. Toynbee Hall has just opened, its Oxford-educated residents arriving in the East End to live among the poor and assist them, and to learn something from the proximity that Oxford could not teach, distributing bread tickets and soup and boots for children in a way that is well-intentioned and complicated, and does not reach everyone who needs it, which is most people. There are the churches and the missions, running penny dinners and Sunday schools and temperance meetings, at which the connection between gin and suffering is explained to people who are already well acquainted with both sides of the equation. And then there is the mutual support that requires no institution at all. A woman who has a little lends it to a neighbour who has less, on the understanding that when the positions reverse, which they will because they always do, the lending will flow back the other way. A family takes in a cousin, or a mother's sister, or a man who lodges with them for 2 shillings a week, because 2 shillings a week is 2 shillings a week, and the floor space is already there. Children run errands for pennies. Grandmothers mind infants, so that their daughters can take in washing, and the washing of the West End comes east on a cart and goes back west again in a basket, starched and folded and pressed, and nobody in the house where it originated thinks very carefully about the hands that have transformed it, because the distance between west and east is not only geographic. In the autumn of 1888, the East End acquires a notoriety that falls on it like something unwelcome and heavy and not entirely real. The murders begin in August. By the time October arrives, the name Whitechapel has been printed in every newspaper in England and many outside it, and the East End has become in the public imagination something it is not quite in reality. A place of unbroken darkness, an abyss at the edge of civilization, a mystery that the respectable city cannot solve because it cannot bring itself to fully enter. Journalists arrive and write about the narrow courts as though the courts themselves are the crime. Police arrive and are conspicuously present and conspicuously ineffective. Letters arrive at newspapers and at Scotland Yard, signed with a name that may or may not belong to anyone real. the city looks east and sees something it needs to believe is entirely foreign to itself. The people who actually live there see it differently. They see their street and their neighbours and the children playing in the court despite the cold, because the court is the only outside there is. They see the woman who sells hot eels from the corner and the old man who mends umbrellas and the young Irish family who have arrived recently and are making the same calculations about survival that everyone around them has been making for years. They are afraid because they have reason to be afraid, because the danger is in their streets and not in the imagination of a newspaper editor in Fleet Street. But fear is not all they are. They are also, despite everything, and in ways that should not need saying but somehow always do, entirely human. The courts fill up toward evening. Fires are lit where there is coal to light them. The lodging house kitchen begins to smell of something being cooked, which is evidence of a day that has gone well enough. The children are called in from the dark. The East End settles, as it always settles, into the long negotiation with the night. Cross the city westward, and the air itself seems to change register. It is not only cleaner, though it is cleaner. It is not only quieter, though by the standards of the East End, it is almost preternaturally so. It is something in the quality of the silence that makes the difference. The particular silence of a street that has been designed to be silent, where the roads are macadamized to muffle the sound of carriage wheels, where the houses set themselves back from the pavement at a distance that communicates, without saying anything, that the occupants value space as only people who have always had it can value it, as something so natural it does not require comment. This is Mayfair. This is Belgravia. This is Kensington in the early afternoon. And the world it represents is not a different city from the one to the east, exactly. But it is a city that has been allowed, by the accumulation of money over several generations, to forget that the other one exists. Begin with the clubs, because the clubs are where the day acquires its formal architecture for a certain kind of man. The clubs of St. James's and Pall Mall are buildings of considerable seriousness. They are built in the manner of Italian palaces, which is not accidental, because a building that resembles an Italian palace communicates a particular set of ideas about permanence and civilization and the kind of man who belongs inside it. The Reform Club, the Athenaeum, Brooks's. Each one carries its own social grammar, its own admission criteria, its own understanding of which kind of gentleman it is prepared to contain. A man's club in 1888 is not merely a place to eat luncheon, though the luncheon is very good. It is a statement about who he is and who his father was and where he was educated and what he thinks about the arrangement of the world, expressed entirely without words, through the simple fact of membership. Inside, the atmosphere is one of ordered repose. Leather armchairs arranged at distances that make conversation possible, but do not require it. Newspapers on long wooden rods. A fire maintained at precisely the temperature that a servant has learned, through long experience, his employer's comfort demands. Men who have made decisions that affect the governance of India, or the price of railway shares, or the outcome of parliamentary votes will sit in these chairs in the afternoon and read and say very little, and their stillness will communicate a great deal about the relationship between power and the performance of leisure, which is that power, when it is sufficiently established, does not need to be seen working. The offices of the city are different in texture, but continuous in the values they represent. By 9 o'clock, the counting houses and banking rooms are filled with clerks who earn between £70 and £200 a year and who consider themselves, with great seriousness, to be members of the middle class, which in 1888 is less an economic category than a moral one. The clerk who earns £80 a year and the merchant who earns £8,000 occupy the same imaginative universe, share the same vocabulary of propriety and self-improvement and respectability, worship at the same chapel of industry and deferred gratification. What separates them is degree. What unites them is the absolute conviction that they are not the people on the other side of the city. Respectability in 1888 is a very precise instrument. It is measured in the whiteness of a collar, which must be freshly starched each morning, and which communicates to anyone who understands the language that the person wearing it does not perform physical labour, or at least not the kind that soils. It is measured in the maintenance of a front parlour that is kept for visitors and is therefore almost never used, which is precisely the point. The parlour exists to demonstrate that its occupants have a room they can afford not to use. It is measured in the subscription to a newspaper, in the kind of soap purchased, in whether the wife employs a single servant or two, in whether the children attend a board school or a private establishment at 15 shillings a term, in 100 small calibrations of expenditure and appearance that the people making them understand perfectly, and that the people below them in the social register are always in danger of getting wrong. And underneath all of it, performing the labour that makes the appearance of effortless order possible, are the servants. In 1888, 1 in 3 women employed in England is employed in domestic service. In a prosperous household, they are present from before the family wakes until after it sleeps. The housemaid rises at 6 to lay the fires before the family descends, so that when the family descends, the fires are already burning, as though warmth is simply a natural property of the rooms they inhabit, and requires no one to have been cold on their behalf. The cook has been in the kitchen since before that. The parlour maid has polished things that will only be seen for a moment. In a larger house, there is a butler who manages the whole system with the quiet authority of a general who understands that the campaign he is running must appear at all times not to be a campaign at all, but simply the way things are. The mistress of the house manages these people through a relationship that has its own etiquette, its own formal distances, its own careful language. She does not address the cook by her first name. She refers to the housemaid as though the housemaid is a feature of the household rather than a person inside it, in the same way that she might refer to the hall table or the dining room curtains. She maintains a household account book. She calls on other women of her social standing in the afternoons, arriving between 3 and 4 o'clock, leaving her card if they are not receiving, staying no more than 20 minutes if they are, because to stay longer would imply that she has nowhere else to be, which would be a kind of confession she is not prepared to make. The drawing room receives her in the afternoon with its antimacassars and its aspidistra and its carefully chosen arrangement of small objects that tell a story about taste and travel and education, all of it maintained in a state of readiness for precisely this purpose, by a housemaid who has dusted and straightened and removed any evidence that the room has ever been anything other than perfectly composed. This is the mechanism by which comfort is produced. Invisible, constant, human labour, arranged so that its products appear to arise naturally from the world, like weather. And the people performing that labour are not far away. They are in the same building. They are behind the door that leads to the kitchen stairs, or in the attic bedroom with the window that admits the cold, or in the scullery at 10 o'clock at night washing the last of the dinner things in water that has been lukewarm since 8. They are separated from the family they serve by the thinnest possible architecture of class. A door, a staircase, a different entrance at the back of the house, and by the much thicker, much more durable architecture of understanding about who belongs on which side of it. The comfortable rooms of Kensington and Mayfair and the quiet streets of Clapham and Camberwell are not innocent of the city beyond them. They depend on it. The coal in the fireplace has come from the north on a railway built by men who are not warm. The joint of beef on the dining room table has passed through hands in Smithfield Market that are never quite clean. The collar that signals the clerk's respectability has been laundered somewhere in Whitechapel by a woman who bends over a washboard before the city is awake. The comfortable city and the uncomfortable one are not two places. They are the same place, running on the same engine, drawing from the same deep reserve of labour and endurance and human capacity to bear difficulty without it being noticed by the people for whom the difficulty is performed. The drawing-room curtains are closed against the evening. The fire is attended. The parlour-maid brings the tea tray with a silence that has been practised into invisibility. Outside, the city continues its work. Now consider the children. They are everywhere in 1888 London, if you know how to look. They are in the streets before the schools open, and in the streets long after the schools have closed, and in some cases in the streets instead of the schools entirely, because the street is where the economics of their family's survival have placed them. And economics in 1888 is not a force that makes exceptions for the very young. There are roughly 1 million children in London. What happens to them depends, almost entirely, on which side of the city they were born into. And this is not a metaphor. The address a child arrives into is, in most cases, the address that determines everything. What they eat, whether they can read, what their hands will be doing in 10 years, what their hands will be doing for the rest of their lives after that. Talent exists in equal measure across the city. Talent is not the variable. The variable is the room behind the door where the mother is waiting when the child is born, and whether that room has a fire in it, and whether there is enough food on the table to keep a mind alert enough to learn. Begin with the schools, because the schools are where the optimism of the age is most visibly at work. The Education Act of 1870 has made elementary schooling available to all children in England. It has not yet made it compulsory everywhere in the precise sense, not uniformly enforced. But the board schools have been going up across London for nearly 2 decades now. Large purposeful brick buildings, 3 stories in many cases, designed with a seriousness that communicates the Victorian conviction that education is a moral project as much as an intellectual one. The London School Board has built hundreds of them. They rise above the rooflines of the streets they serve, deliberate in their scale, as though height alone might communicate to the children inside them that they are being elevated. Step inside one of these board schools in the East End on a morning in 1888. The classroom holds 60 children, or sometimes more. They sit at long wooden desks in rows, arranged with a precision that is not accidental, because the arrangement of bodies in rows communicates something specific about the arrangement of knowledge, which flows in one direction, from the front, and the correct response to it is attention and stillness, and the careful reproduction of what has been transmitted. The teacher, a young woman in many cases, trained at a teaching college, earning perhaps £60 a year, stands at the front beside a blackboard and a cane that rests against the wall, and is not merely decorative. The lessons are conducted by repetition. Tables are chanted. Letters are copied onto slates with a squeaking precision that fills the room with its particular sound. Spelling is tested by dictation. Sums are worked on paper when paper is available, on slates when it is not. The curriculum is not designed to produce curiosity, or rather curiosity is not its primary instrument. It is designed to produce legibility, numeracy, and the capacity to follow instruction, which are the things that the economy of 1888 requires from the children of the working class, and the school board, to its credit, is providing them. Discipline is physical, and it is certain, and it is administered without much reflection. A boy who cannot recite his multiplication tables by Thursday will have known since Monday that Thursday has a particular character. The cane is used for failures of memory as well as failures of conduct, which is an approach that conflates the two, that treats the inability to remember as a moral rather than a cognitive condition. And yet the children come. They come in boots with holes in the soles, and with hair that the school nurse will examine weekly for lice, and with stomachs that are not always full enough to make concentration easy. And they sit in their rows, and they chant their tables, and some of them, the ones the teacher notices, the ones who show the particular quality of attention that stands out, even in a room of 60, learn to read with a fluency that opens something in them, some door that was always there but required this specific key. For the children of Kensington and Clapham and the quieter streets of the middle-class city, schooling is a different instrument entirely. The private establishment at 15 shillings a term, the preparatory school, the grammar school with its Latin and its examination culture, and its careful cultivation of the kind of young man who will one day enter a profession. These institutions are not building legibility. They are building a self. They are building the vocabulary of command, the habit of confidence, the particular manner that a public school education in England produces, and that is recognisable at 40 paces in any room in the country. The boys at these schools are being educated not merely in what to know, but in how to carry what they know, which is its own form of knowledge, perhaps the most durable kind, the kind that moves through a room before its owner opens his mouth. The girls of the same class receive a different education, which is to say they receive an education in becoming the kind of woman who presides over a drawing room with invisible competence. French, pianoforte, watercolour, the domestic arts elevated to accomplishments. The curriculum is not designed to produce independence, because independence in a woman is not, in 1888, the destination the curriculum is pointing toward. It is designed to produce readiness, readiness for marriage, readiness for household management, readiness for the particular performance of cultivation and refinement that the comfortable classes require their women to perform. And then there are the children who do not go to school at all. They are not a small number. The school attendance officer, the board man as the children call him, and not affectionately, walks certain streets in the East End with the steady patience of someone who understands that the battle he is fighting is not against indifference, but against poverty, which is a far more formidable opponent. A family in which a father is sick and a mother takes in piecework from a shirt manufacturer needs the 12-year-old contributing to the household income in some form, and a morning in school is a morning not spent contributing, and the mathematics of this are not complicated. The street children work. They sell matches, newspapers, flowers. They run errands. The very young ones, the ones not yet in their teens, move through the market streets of the East End with a quick professional knowledge of where the opportunities are, who tips and who does not, which traders need a parcel carried, which hours bring the most foot traffic. They are small adults in the way that children in poverty are always small adults, worn down into competence before the growing is finished, before whatever it is that childhood is supposed to be has had the time to fully occur. Some of them are sleeping in doorways. There are organisations that know this and are working against it. The Barnardo Homes have been taking in children off the streets of the East End for nearly 20 years now. The ragged schools have been running longer. The impulse behind them is genuine. A real, and in some cases quite anguished awareness on the part of certain people that the city is consuming its children at a rate that ought to trouble a civilization that considers itself Christian. And yet, the institutions can absorb only so many. The streets absorb more. What the children of 1888 London carry, across all the distances of class and geography that separate them, is time. They have it in a way that the adults around them, ground down by labour and worry and the physical accumulation of difficult years, have largely spent. The boy at the board school who discovers that he can read, who takes a book home and finds that it takes him somewhere. He is carrying something that the city has not yet managed to take from him. The girl in the Kensington schoolroom who commits a French verb to memory, and then, for a moment, looks out the window at the garden and thinks something entirely her own. She is also carrying it. The city will make its claim on them soon enough. It always does. But this morning, in these rooms, in these uneven and imperfect and occasionally brutal institutions that are at least attempting something in the direction of a future, the children of London are still, briefly, becoming. Underneath all of it, underneath the schools and the markets and the labour and the careful domestic routines, there is the body. And the body in 1888 London is engaged in a continuous negotiation with its environment, a negotiation in which the environment holds most of the cards. Begin with the water, because the water is where everything begins. London in 1888 is served by a network of private water companies that draw from the Thames and its tributaries and distribute the result through iron pipes to homes across the city. The water that comes out of those pipes has improved enormously in the past 30 years. The great sewer system that Joseph Bazalgette built through the 1860s, 83 miles of main sewers, more than 1,000 miles of smaller ones, moving the city's waste east toward the estuary rather than directly into the river at the city's heart, has done something that no Act of Parliament or social reform could accomplish alone. It has made it possible for people to drink a glass of water without thinking about what they are drinking, in the wealthier districts at least. In the East End, the calculation is different. The pipes that bring water to Whitechapel and Bethnal Green and Stepney are older, maintained with less consistency, and the supply is intermittent in a way that creates its own problem. Water is stored in tanks and butts inside buildings, sitting through the days between deliveries, acquiring qualities that the sitting does nothing to improve. The courts and alleys where the poorest families live, the ones the housing reformers call rookeries, using a word that suggests birds, but means something closer to the compacted desperation of human poverty at its most concentrated. These places have shared standpipes, one for a court that might hold 50 people, water available for a period each day and not available after that. And what is available is used for everything, for cooking and washing and drinking and all the competing necessities of life that do not resolve themselves simply because the supply is limited. The smell is the thing that visitors to London notice first and remember longest. Not the sewer smell, which is present but which Bazalgette's system has reduced to something more manageable than the catastrophic stench that forced Parliament to hang curtains soaked in chloride of lime in 1858. The smell of 1888 is more complicated than that. It is coal smoke and horse dung. There are 300,000 horses in London, and each one produces quantities that the arithmetic of this makes staggering. And the particular compound smell of people living in close proximity without adequate ventilation, and the smell of tanneries and glue factories, and the 100 small industrial processes that conduct themselves in the middle of residential streets, because zoning, in the modern sense, does not yet exist. You live where the work is, and the work smells of what it is. Tuberculosis is the disease that 1888 London fears in the way that earlier generations feared cholera. It is everywhere. It moves through the overcrowded rooms of the East End with a patient and unhurried certainty, taking its time, which is one of the things about it that makes it so devastating. It takes years, sometimes, wearing a person down through stages that allow hope to keep reasserting itself, right until the moment when hope becomes untenable. It is called consumption because it consumes, and the consumption is visible, which is why the pale and wasting figure of the consumptive has acquired, in middle-class Victorian culture, a strange aesthetic quality, a romanticization of the illness that the people actually dying of it in the back courts of Spitalfields would find, if they were aware of it, difficult to understand. There is also typhoid, passed through contaminated water in places where the improvements have not reached, or where they have been undermined by a cracked pipe, a leaking joint, a landlord who has deferred a repair because deferred repairs are cheaper than completed ones. Scarlet fever. Diphtheria, which takes children with a particular swiftness that parents learn to dread in the season when it moves through a school or a street. Rickets, which is not a communicable disease, but a consequence of the diet that poverty produces, of childhood spent in rooms and courts where the sun reaches the floor for perhaps an hour a day, of the particular deformities that grow from deprivation made structural, written into the growing bones. The doctor, when he comes, arrives with a black bag and a confidence that is not always matched by the tools available to him. Victorian medicine in 1888 is at an extraordinary transitional moment. Germ theory, the understanding that specific diseases are caused by specific microorganisms, not by miasmas or bad air or the general quality of an environment, has been established for a decade. Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch have done the foundational work. And yet the practical application of this understanding, the translation of it into medical practice and into the habits of daily clinical life, is still in progress. Your doctor in 1888 understands in principle more than his predecessor of 20 years ago understood. His confidence that cleanliness matters, that ventilation matters, that specific pathogens cause specific conditions, is better grounded than it has ever been. What he cannot do is cure most of what he treats. He can set bones and lance abscesses and deliver babies with a competence that has improved over the decades. He can advise, and his advice is increasingly worth following. He can prescribe, and what he prescribes from the shelves of the chemist, the pharmacist with his coloured glass bottles in the window, his shop smelling of camphor and licorice and something astringent underneath both, is a mixture of the genuinely useful and the emphatically not. Quinine works against malaria. Some of the tonics work against nothing at all except the anxiety of the patient, which is its own form of working. Laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, is available without prescription and is used for everything from the cough of a consumptive to the sleeplessness of a teething infant, and the fact that it is calming and effective and also deeply habit-forming is a concern that the era has not yet fully assembled into a coherent response. The hospitals exist, and they are not the charnel houses they were at the beginning of the century. The great London teaching hospitals, St. Bartholomew's, Guy's, the London Hospital in Whitechapel Road, have wards that are cleaner, better ventilated, more systematically organised than any previous generation has managed. Florence Nightingale's influence is visible in the physical arrangement of the wards, in the ratio of nurses to patients, in the emphasis on air and light, and the careful management of infection that makes the difference between a hospital as a place of recovery and a hospital as a place where the disease you arrive with is joined by diseases you acquire from the patients beside you. But for the families of the East End, the hospital is a last resort, and not a first one. Before the hospital comes the home remedy, passed between women across generations, compounded from knowledge and necessity, and the particular ingenuity of people who cannot afford to be without a solution. Goose fat on a chest for the cough, mustard plasters, penny royal for certain women's conditions in ways that the women understand and do not discuss openly. The chemist consulted across the counter with a discretion that goes in both directions, because discretion is part of what the chemist sells, along with the preparation in the paper packet. And then there is the difference between the streets. A child in Mayfair who contracts scarlet fever is taken to a room with a fire, and a nurse and a doctor who calls every day and time and good food and the full attentiveness of a household organised around recovery. A child in a court off Dorset Street who contracts the same disease, has the same disease and nothing else that is the same. Not the room, shared, cold, without ventilation. Not the food, insufficient before the illness and more insufficient during it. Not the doctor, too expensive, summoned if at all only at the end, when summoning is a gesture toward conscience rather than a practical intervention. The germ does not distinguish. The germ is democratic in the way that 1888 London is not. It is the conditions around the germ that determine everything, whether the body that encounters it is strong enough, rested enough, well fed enough to resist, whether recovery is possible in the place where the body must attempt it, whether the network of care and resource that surrounds a person at their most vulnerable is sufficient to hold them up. For most of London, it is barely sufficient, or it is not sufficient at all. This is not a condition that people in 1888 regard as inevitable, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the era. They know it is wrong. The reformers are writing about it. The newspapers are publishing about it. The sanitary inspectors are walking the courts with their notebooks and their inadequate powers and their genuine conviction that the city is capable of better than it is currently providing. The knowledge is there. The will, in certain quarters, is there. The gap is between the will and the apparatus, the laws, the resources, the political machinery, required to close the distance between the child in Mayfair and the child in Dorset Street, before one more winter does its quiet and unremarkable and entirely preventable work. And yet people find ways to breathe, not metaphorically, though the metaphor holds too, but literally, physically, actually. They find the gaps in the day where the pressure of it all releases slightly, where the foreman's voice is at a distance, and the landlord has not yet knocked, and the particular grinding forward motion of survival pauses long enough to become something that is not quite survival, that is something closer to pleasure. The afternoon does this in London in 1888. It offers cracks of light, narrow ones, different ones depending on who you are and what you earn, and which side of the enormous social canyon you inhabit, but cracks nonetheless. And through them comes something that keeps a city of 4.5 million people from becoming entirely a machine for exhaustion. Start with the park, because the park is the great democratic promise of Victorian London, and like most democratic promises, it is only partially kept. Hyde Park and Regent's Park and Victoria Park in the East End. These are the lungs the reformers fought to preserve, the open acres that the housing developers were not allowed to swallow, the places where the city pauses and pretends for a moment to be something other than itself. On a Sunday afternoon in October, when the work has released its grip for a few hours, and the weather is doing its best within the limits of an English October, you will find all of them there. The nursemaid pushing the perambulator of a Kensington family, walking the prescribed circuits with the careful posture of someone who knows she is visible. The clerk from the city, his collar slightly loosened, his hat still on, sitting on a bench with a newspaper that he has already read once on the omnibus, and is now reading again, because newspapers in 1888 are a form of leisure in a way that we have perhaps forgotten. Long, dense, opinionated, full of letters from readers with strong feelings about the condition of the nation. The working man who has threepence in his pocket and nowhere in particular to be, feeding bread to the ducks with an expression of focused generosity that suggests the ducks are doing him a favour by accepting it. And then there is the pub. The public house is the centre of leisure life for working London, in a way that is difficult to overstate, and that causes the temperance movement, and the evangelical reformers and the middle-class observers who write reports about the condition of the poor a very great deal of anxiety. The pub is warm when the room at home is cold. It is lit when the street outside is dark. It sells a glass of bitter or a tot of gin for a penny or two, and it does not ask about your circumstances or your past, or the gap between your wages and your rent. The landlord is a figure of genuine social consequence on his street. He knows everyone. He extends occasional credit with the wariness of a man who has been burned before. He maintains a fire and a piano, and a tolerance for the full, complicated humanity of his clientele that the churches and the chapels and the reform societies that want to replace the pub with something improving and alcohol-free consistently fail to match. The Gin Palace is the grander version, all etched glass and mahogany and brass fittings, and a bar that goes on longer than seems architecturally reasonable. And it is magnificent in the way that only a Victorian excess can be magnificent, which is to say completely and without apology. Women come here too, which is one of the things that alarms the temperance campaigners, because respectable women are not supposed to be in pubs, and the fact that they are, in considerable numbers, suggests that respectability's map of the world does not match the territory. Not far from the pub in spirit, though a great deal louder in execution, is the Music Hall. The Music Hall in 1888 is at the peak of its influence, and if you have never seen one, you cannot quite imagine what it means to the people who fill it every Thursday and Saturday and Friday evening, who save their pennies for it the way other people save for doctors or boots or a week's extra coal. The halls are in every district: the Oxford, the Alhambra, the Canterbury, the Britannia in Hoxton, and they offer something that neither the Church nor the Reforming Society can manufacture, which is professional talent deployed in the service of pure, uncomplicated delight. The comedians who trade in the particular miseries of London life, the landlord, the mother-in-law, the foreman, the policeman, the gap between what a man earns and what his wife expects, draw laughter from the gallery that is recognition as much as it is amusement. We know this, the laughter says. We live inside this. And for 3 hours in the evening it becomes material for a song, and the material of a song is manageable in a way that the material of a life sometimes is not. Marie Lloyd is performing this year. The name means something, even if you don't know the songs, because the songs are everywhere, whistled in streets and hummed in kitchens and sung in the back rooms of pubs by men who are trying to remember the second verse. The music hall gives London a shared culture across the class lines that divide everything else. A repertoire of jokes and songs and catchphrases that a costermongress in Bethnal Green and a clerk in Islington might both know, which is not a small thing in a city that fragments people into their separate circumstances with considerable efficiency. For the middle classes, the leisure of the afternoon arranges itself differently, and with more anxiety about whether it is being done correctly. The tea shop is a relatively new institution in 1888, and it is performing a social service that its proprietors perhaps did not entirely anticipate, which is providing a place where women of respectable standing can sit in public without a male escort and consume refreshments without their respectability being questioned. The ABC, the aerated bread company, has shops across London, plain and clean and affordable, serving tea and buns and sandwiches, and the women who sit in them are doing something that seems small and is not small at all, which is existing in public on their own terms. A woman alone in a restaurant in 1888 is a problem requiring explanation. A woman alone in an ABC is simply a woman having tea, and the distinction matters enormously. Sport is asserting itself across the city in ways that are changing what leisure looks like and what bodies are expected to do with themselves. Cricket in summer, football increasingly in autumn and winter. The Football League is only in its second season in 1888, and the great popular religion that it will become is still in its formation. And the cycling craze that is just beginning to gather the momentum that will make it, by the mid-1890s, the dominant leisure obsession of the middle classes. The bicycle is waiting at the edge of this year, promising freedom of movement to women in particular that the decade is not quite ready for but is about to receive. And then there is reading. The penny press, the penny dreadful, the sensation novel borrowed from the lending library for a small weekly fee, Mudie's circulating library with its 3-volume novels and its careful moral gatekeeping, the free public library that some boroughs have established under the Public Libraries Act, the newspaper shared between 4 people in a coffee house and read in sequence while the coffee grows cold. London in 1888 reads with an appetite that the era's critics find alarming, because readers who have acquired the habit of fiction have acquired the habit of imagining lives different from their own, which is a habit whose consequences are difficult to control. The sensation novels that middle-class readers consume in quantity, murder, inheritance, concealed identity, passion managing itself badly, are their own form of the escape that the gin palace and the music hall provide to the working poor. Different vehicles, the same engine, running on the same fuel, which is the desire to be somewhere else for a little while. What leisure reveals about London in 1888, if you watch it carefully, and the reformers do watch it carefully, with notebooks, with a concern that sometimes looks like censure, and sometimes actually is what the city is escaping from. The warmth of the pub says something about the cold of the room at home. The delirium of the music hall says something about the relentlessness of the work. The woman quietly having tea alone says something about the narrowness of the space she inhabits in all the hours that are not this one. Pleasure in 1888. London is not frivolous. It is structural. It is the counterweight that the city requires to keep moving forward through the weight of everything it carries. And the weight, as the afternoon gives way to evening and the lamps begin to come on in the streets, is considerable. And as the lamps come on and the afternoon folds into evening, London becomes a different kind of city. Not unrecognizable. Still the same streets, the same smells, the same river making its dark, indifferent way toward the sea. But something shifts in the quality of the air when the light goes. Something that 4.5 million people feel in a way they could not entirely articulate, which is that the city, after dark, operates by different rules, and that not all of those rules are written down anywhere or enforced by anyone with a badge. Crime in 1888. London is not an aberration. It is a feature of the landscape in the way that fog is a feature, in the way that poverty is a feature. Present, persistent, sometimes invisible until you step into it, and distributed across the city with the same merciless logic that distributes everything else, which means it clusters where the money is scarce and the desperation is not. Petty theft is the most common form of it, and petty theft is so common in certain districts that it barely registers as remarkable. The pickpocket working the crowd outside a music hall or a railway station, nimble, patient, moving with the practiced invisibility of someone who has learned that the best concealment is a face that looks as though it belongs. The child who lifts an apple from a barrow and runs with the focused commitment of someone who has done this before and calculated the risk accurately. The opportunist who follows a drunk man home from the pub with intentions that are clear to everyone except the drunk man, who is in no condition to read the situation. These are the crimes of necessity more often than they are the crimes of appetite, committed in the thin margins between what wages provide and what survival requires, and the magistrates' courts process them in volume every Monday morning with the weary efficiency of a mechanism that has been doing the same work for so long that the individual cases have ceased to feel individual. Prostitution runs through London like a second economy, parallel to the respectable one, taxed by no one, regulated by nothing except the inconstant attention of the police and the permanent attention of the reformers who want to save the women involved and who disagree violently among themselves about the best method of salvation. The estimates vary wildly. Somewhere between 50,000 and 80,000 women in London selling sex at some point in the year, though the numbers are impossible to verify because the category bleeds at its edges into every arrangement of survival that women in desperate circumstances make with men who have slightly more money than they do. The Strand on a Saturday evening, Haymarket, the streets around Covent Garden, these are the public theatres of it, visible enough that visitors from the provinces find them shocking, familiar enough to Londoners that they are simply part of the visual texture of the night. And then there is the policing. The Metropolitan Police in 1888 is 59 years old, an institution still young enough that memory of London without it remains intact in the oldest residents, still finding the edges of its authority in a city that has not entirely decided how much authority it wants the police to have. The constable on his beat is a figure of genuine presence in the daily life of the street, not universally respected, not universally trusted, regarded differently depending entirely on whether you are the person who calls him or the person he is coming toward. He walks his route in a pattern that is known, recorded, inspectable by his sergeant, measured against the clock. He carries a truncheon. He blows a whistle. He has, in theory, the power to arrest on reasonable suspicion, and in practice, the exercise of that power is shaped by factors that have very little to do with the law. In respectable neighbourhoods, he is a reassurance. A uniform passing under the gaslight outside a Kensington terrace is the city keeping its implicit promise to the people who have paid for the good address. In the East End, he is something more complicated, present in numbers that suggest surveillance more than protection, familiar enough to be navigated, distrusted enough that a significant portion of the population will not go to him with a problem, because experience has taught them that going to the police with a problem is one reliable method of acquiring two problems. Commissioner Charles Warren runs the Metropolitan Police in 1888, and he runs it with the manner of a military man who has been placed in charge of a civilian institution and has not entirely adjusted to the difference. His officers are stretched across a city that keeps growing faster than the force does. They work long shifts in conditions that are physically demanding, in ways that the people who design the shifts perhaps do not fully appreciate. Because the people who design the shifts are not the ones walking the streets of Whitechapel in November at 2 a.m. in boots that are letting in the rain. But 1888 is not simply a year of ordinary crime and ordinary policing. 1888 is the year of something else. The autumn of this year belongs, in the newspapers and in the imagination of the city, to the murders in Whitechapel. The killings attributed to the figure the press has named Jack the Ripper, a name that did not exist before this year and will not be forgotten after it. 5 women killed in the streets and courts of Whitechapel between August and November, killed with a violence that the newspapers describe in detail, calibrated precisely to produce the maximum combination of horror and readership. Detail that pushes against the edges of what Victorian print culture allows itself to say, and then pushes past those edges because the demand is there and the demand is enormous. The newspapers are the engine of the fear, and they know it, and they do not stop. The letter columns fill with theories. The editorials fill with demands that the police do something, that the government do something, that someone in authority do something that will make the streets of Whitechapel safe for women who are in no realistic position to leave them. The police receive letters from the public and from people claiming to be the killer, and they cannot tell which are genuine and which are fantasies and which are newspaper fabrications. Because some of the letters are newspaper fabrications, and the newspapers are not embarrassed about this, because embarrassment requires a standard of conduct that has not been agreed upon and would not be commercially advantageous anyway. What the Whitechapel murders do to London in the autumn of 1888 is something that goes beyond the specific horror of 5 specific deaths, which are real deaths, which are the deaths of real women with real histories and real people who knew them and who are now carrying the particular weight that violent loss creates. What the murders do to the broader city is illuminate, with a sudden and unsparing light, something that was already there, the geography of danger, the question of who is protected and who is exposed, the enormous distance between the London of wealth and the London of Spitalfields and Whitechapel that crime maps onto with a precision that should be uncomfortable for the people who benefit from one side of that distance. The fear is real. Women in the East End are afraid in a way that is measurable in the emptiness of streets that would otherwise be occupied. But the fear is also a phenomenon being manufactured in drawing rooms and newspaper offices in parts of the city that are geographically removed from the courts and alleys where the crimes actually occur, a fear that contains within it a certain quality of fascination that Victorian England acknowledges only with embarrassment, if it acknowledges it at all. Because the sensation novel they borrowed from the library, and the penny dreadful read by gaslight, and the letter column about the Whitechapel murders, they are all running on the same engine. The city is frightened. The city is also, and this is the part that is harder to say plainly, riveted. London in 1888 has always lived alongside its own darkness. But this autumn, the darkness has a name that fits on a headline, and the headlines are selling faster than the presses can run them. And on every street corner in the city, in the light of the gas lamps that the police patrol underneath and the fog moves through, someone is reading about what lives in the shadows just east of here. By 6 o'clock, the city has begun to pull itself inward. Not all at once, not uniformly, not in the way that a theatre audience leaves at the same moment when the curtain falls, but something like a gradual contraction happens across London as the evening settles in, as the gaslight becomes necessary rather than supplementary, as the cold that has been present all day becomes impossible to pretend otherwise about. People who have been outside for 10 or 12 or 14 hours begin by degrees to make their way toward whatever constitutes home, and the word home covers such a span of human circumstance in this city that it is almost miraculous that the same word does the work for all of it. In the tenements of Whitechapel and Bermondsey, supper is a serious negotiation between what can be afforded and what the body requires after a day of physical labour. And the answer is almost always a compromise in which the body loses. Bread, dripping if there is any, a piece of cheese, a bowl of something hot if the woman of the house has had the time and the pennies to make it, which she may not have, because she has also been working since before the light came up and the pennies are not a given. The family eats together in the sense that they eat in the same room, which may also be the room where they sleep, where the youngest children have been sleeping for hours already, folded against each other for warmth in the dark corner farthest from the door. The fireplace, if there is one, is burning as little coal as can be made to produce adequate heat, because coal costs money, and money is the permanent problem, the constant denominator underneath every decision made in rooms like this one, in every street east of Aldgate. The light is bad. The air is thick with the smell of the city that has followed everyone in through the door and settled. The exhaustion in these rooms is not the polite tiredness of a long productive day. It is a physical weight, accumulated, layered, the kind of tiredness that does not fully resolve with sleep because the sleep is never quite long enough, and what is required the following morning comes too quickly. Lodgings are something different again. The common lodging houses that shelter tens of thousands of Londoners every night of the year are not quite homes and not quite hotels, and precisely what they are is a kind of surviving, a temporary arrangement that has become permanent by repetition. You pay your 4p for a bed, or you pay 2p for a chair by the fire in the kitchen, and the kitchen is where the evening happens, around the long table with the other lodgers, people whose names you may or may not know, whose stories are as various and as reduced by circumstance as your own. Someone is cooking something on the range. Someone is reading a newspaper that is 3 days old and has passed through so many hands that the print has rubbed to shadow in places. There is conversation, the way there is always conversation in rooms where people are thrown together and have nothing to lose by talking. Conversation that moves from complaint to rumour to the murders. Always, this autumn, to the murders, and then circles back. The evening in a lodging house kitchen has a particular quality of suspended existence, of time passing in a way that is neither pleasant nor unpleasant, simply the hours between the day that has ended and the necessity of tomorrow. Move west, and the evening changes its texture completely. In the suburban terraces of Camberwell and Streatham, in the respectable houses of Hackney and Islington, where the clerk and the schoolteacher and the small businessman live with their families behind their modest but carefully maintained front gardens, the evening has a ritual quality that is itself a form of comfort. Supper is served at a table with a cloth on it. There is a proper meal, cold meat from Sunday, or a mutton chop, or a pie that has been planned for since morning, and it is served in courses, not because there are many courses, but because the serving in stages signals something about the household's relationship to decency and order. The children are present at the table if they are old enough, or they have been fed earlier and put to bed with the minimum of ceremony, because the children's needs are real, but the adult hours after supper are a small domestic sanctuary that working people in the middle of the city defend with some ferocity. After supper, the family sits by the fire. The father reads the paper. The mother sews, which is not leisure in any straightforward sense, because what she is sewing is clothing that needs to be mended or made. Practical work conducted in the guise of the domestic evening, because there is always practical work being conducted in the guise of something else when you are running a household on a salary that does not quite cover everything and requires constant invisible management to appear as though it does. A daughter plays the piano if there is one, a modest upright in the parlour that represents more aspiration than expense and is kept polished, because the appearance of the parlour is the family's public face compressed into a room. There is conversation. There is, occasionally, a book read aloud. The reading aloud is worth noting. In 1888, the novel is the dominant cultural form, and the novel enters these households through multiple channels. The lending library, the serialised instalment in the magazine, the volume passed between neighbours. Dickens is 10 years dead, but present in every parlour bookshelf that aspires to respectability. Wilkie Collins, Mrs. Humphrey Ward, George Eliot, and now, newly, Robert Louis Stevenson's Jekyll and Hyde, published only 2 years ago and already fixed in the imagination of a city that has found in it something that resonates in ways perhaps its readers cannot fully articulate. Something about duality, about the respectable surface and the thing underneath, about what lives in the city after dark, when the civilized arrangements of daylight have been set aside. It resonates particularly in the autumn of 1888, for reasons that do not need to be spelled out, in a city reading about itself in the newspapers every morning, and reading about Hyde every evening by lamplight. In the great houses of Mayfair and Belgravia, the evening is a performance of a different kind. Dinner is not until 8, sometimes later, preceded by dressing. An act that takes the assistance of at least one servant and the investment of time that signals, emphatically, that the people in this house do not experience the evening as a collapse into rest after labour, but as a continuation of the day's social work by other means. The dining room is lit by dozens of candles, and the conversation moves through the expected subjects: politics, the season, who is going where, the perpetual question of Ireland, the murders, if the company is the kind that permits such topics, which some companies are and some are not. After dinner, the men remain with the port, the women withdraw. Eventually the company reconvenes, and there is music or cards, or simply more conversation, and by midnight the carriages are called, and the house settles into the specific quiet of a place that employs 6 people to maintain it, and those 6 people are still awake, somewhere below stairs, still working. But whatever the house, whatever the address, whatever the supper, darkness does something to people in 1888 that is not simply atmospheric. The darkness is not safe in the way that daylight is safe, not because daylight is safe. Whitechapel is not safe in daylight either, not for everyone. but because darkness removes the visibility that is one of the city's basic operating conditions. When you cannot be seen as well, you are less protected. The gaslight helps, but the gaslight only reaches so far, and the spaces between the lamps are real spaces, real dark, real opportunity for whatever the city's darkness contains. So the evening indoors is also, for many people, a kind of shelter from that. The fire, the lamp, the closed door between the family and the street. These are not simply comforts. They are, in a city of 4.5 million people, navigating an autumn that has made the dark feel inhabited by something specific and terrible, a form of small, deliberate safety. The bolts go across, the curtains are pulled, the coal shifts in the grate, and the room holds its warmth. And outside the window, London continues its business, the city that never fully sleeps, moving through its own night with the knowledge that behind most of these lit windows, someone has chosen, for now, to stay inside. The fire dies down, the candle gutters, and somewhere out there, beyond the glass, the city is still awake, and out there is worth dwelling on. Because London after dark is not simply the daytime city with the light removed. It is a different arrangement of the same 4.5 million people, redistributed according to different needs and different compulsions, governed by different rules that are not written down anywhere, but are understood by everyone who moves through these streets after the respectable households have drawn their curtains and the children have been folded into their beds. The city does not sleep. It shifts. It changes frequency, the way a piece of music might modulate into a different key. The melody still recognizable, but the feeling underneath it altered entirely. The gaslights burn on through the night, though not uniformly, not everywhere. On the main thoroughfares, Oxford Street, the Strand, Fleet Street, Cheapside, the lamps stand close enough together that a person walking feels, if not exactly safe, then at least visible, which is its own form of protection. The light is amber and wavering and throws shadows that move even when there is no wind, that give the empty street a quality of inhabited unease, as though the darkness beyond the lamp's reach is not empty, but watching. Between the lamps there are gaps, and in the side streets and the courts and the alleys that run off the known routes into the obscure interior of the city's older neighbourhoods, the dark is nearly complete. The moon, if there is one, cannot reach down between buildings that lean toward each other overhead, as though in conversation. Down there, in those compressed passages, it is 1888 in a way that no gaslight softens. But even here, there is movement. The night workers of London represent an entire world of labour that the daylight city prefers not to look at too directly. The street sweepers who come out after midnight when the traffic has thinned enough to make the work possible, pushing the accumulated residue of the day's commerce and movement into mounds that will be collected before morning. The newspaper compositors who work through the small hours to have the morning edition ready by 5, whose hands are permanently ink-stained, and whose days and nights have been inverted so long that daylight feels foreign and wrong, like a language they once spoke but have mostly forgotten. The bakers, already awake at 2 in the morning and at work by 3, heating the ovens that will produce the loaves that will be on the carts by 6. The fishmongers' porters arriving at Billingsgate before dawn to unload the night's catch from the trains and carts, working in the cold and the smell with a speed and roughness that is its own form of skilled labour, unremarked upon and underpaid, in the way that all skilled labour conducted in darkness and cold tends to be unremarked upon and underpaid. The markets are in their own strange intermediate state at this hour. Covent Garden never entirely closes. There is always someone there, always some transaction being completed or prepared for. The vegetable carts arriving from the market gardens south of the river, the porters who carry impossible loads balanced on their heads with a practiced grace that visitors to the city find astonishing, and that the porters themselves have long since ceased to notice as remarkable. The smell of the market at 3 in the morning is extraordinary, green and cold and earthy, a smell of growing things in a city that contains almost no growing things, and underneath it, the sharper smell of rot where yesterday's unsold produce has been left to whatever fate awaits it, which is usually one of the city's many small economies of salvage and reuse. The last trains ran hours ago. The omnibuses stopped at midnight. The cabs are still out. There are always cabs. But for the person without money, the night means remaining where you are, or walking, and many people are walking. They move through the streets with the particular purposefulness of those who have somewhere to go, and the particular purposelessness of those who do not. And from a distance it can be difficult to distinguish between the two. A woman walking alone after midnight is read differently by different observers, by the constable on his beat, by the man stepping out of the tavern, by the other women who recognise her situation by signs too subtle and too familiar to require articulation. The constable tips his head. The city accommodates what it has always accommodated and will continue to accommodate regardless of the sermons preached about it, the pamphlets distributed, the committees formed. There is not enough housing, not enough work, not enough of anything that might make the alternatives to this unnecessary. And the city has long made peace with its own arrangements in the way that large, complicated systems make peace with their own contradictions, which is to say by not examining them too carefully. The taverns are still serving, those that have not yet called last orders. Through the fogged glass, the light is warm and yellow, human warmth muffled and compressed. The sound of voices a low, continuous murmur, that is itself a kind of comfort even from outside, especially from outside, for the person on the pavement who cannot afford what is on offer within. The drinkers inside are in their last half hour of the evening, or their first, depending on what kind of night they are having and what drives them here. Working men, finishing late shifts, night watchmen on their break, a journalist with his notebook, observing with the professional detachment that is this decade's preferred mode of encounter with human suffering. A woman with paint on her face and a glass of gin she has been making last an hour, because the warmth of the room is worth the price of the glass, and she has nowhere better to be. Someone at the back of the room laughing too loudly at something. Someone else with his head down on the table, sleeping in the way of the utterly exhausted, too tired even for the thin horizontal bed, waiting at the lodging house, sleeping now, here, in the noise and the light. And across all of this, over all of this, the unspoken presence that has been present since the autumn began, and has not been resolved, and will not be resolved this night, or any night, for weeks yet. Whitechapel is only a mile from here. Less. The newspapers have been specific about geography, have published maps, have named the streets. Every person in London knows those street names now in a way they did not know them in July. The constables on their beats in the east of the city walk a little differently than they did before August. The women who have no choice but to be out in the dark after midnight are aware of something they were not fully aware of before, something the newspapers have given a shape and a location and an eerie absence of resolution. The city absorbs this awareness and continues functioning, because cities always continue functioning, because the milk must still be delivered, and the bread must still be baked, and the papers must still be printed, and the constable must still walk his beat, regardless of what lives in the autumn dark alongside everything else. This is London in 1888. Not a single city, but dozens of cities layered onto the same ground, pressing against each other, sharing the same river and the same fog and the same November dark, without sharing very much else. The child asleep in the Mayfair nursery and the child asleep in the Whitechapel court are sleeping a mile apart under the same sky and inhabiting entirely different worlds, different chances, different futures that have already been largely decided by the accident of the address they were born into. The clerk in Camberwell has bolted his door. The woman in the common lodging house kitchen is still sitting by the range because the chair costs nothing extra, and the room is warm and the morning is coming whether she is ready for it or not. The newspaper compositor is setting type in the lamplight. The constable has turned the corner into the long straight street and is walking north, his footsteps the only sound. The gas burns in its glass case above the empty pavement, amber and steady and cold. The city has come all the way around. It is almost tomorrow. Somewhere, already, someone is lighting the first fire of the new day, and the smoke rises into the London dark and joins all the other smoke, all the accumulated breath and industry of 4.5 million lives pressing on into another morning, as they always have, as they always will, the great exhausted unstoppable machine of the city turning, turning, turning toward the light. And that is what a single day holds. One day in London in 1888. One rotation of the city through its full range of registers. The cold dark of the pre-dawn streets, the first fires being coaxed into life in a million grates, the children being shaken awake in attic rooms and basement rooms, and rooms that are not quite rooms but serve as them. Breakfast eaten standing, or not eaten at all. The long walk to work, the long day at the loom or the ledger or the lathe. The market in its noise and its smell. The schoolroom, chalky and overcrowded and earnest in its ambitions for children who will have precious little opportunity to use what they are being taught. The afternoon, the evening, the slow withdrawal from the public world back into whatever private world a person has managed to construct, however thin its walls, however insufficient its warmth. What a single day reveals, if you stay with it long enough, is the architecture of the thing, not the buildings, though the buildings are everywhere, pressing, multiplying, the new terraces marching south and east and north across what was recently farmland. But the deeper architecture, the structure of how lives are arranged and against what forces they push and what pushes back. Victorian London in 1888 is a city in the business of enormous self-belief, convinced of its own greatness, and it is not wrong about this exactly. The empire administered from these offices and chambers and counting houses spans the world. The wealth passing through these docks and banks and exchanges is without precedent in human history. The newspapers, the theatres, the concert halls, the learned societies, the libraries accumulating volumes at a rate that no previous civilization has managed, all of it pointing in the direction of progress, of accumulation, of the steady improvement of the human condition by the application of British industry and British capital and British confidence in the rightness of its own arrangements. And yet, a mile from the Bank of England, children sleep 6 to a room in buildings without sanitation or light. A short walk from the theatres of the Strand, women sell their company for the price of a bed. The river that runs through the heart of the greatest city in the world is still a moving channel of disease and waste, still capable of killing those who drink from it or live too close to its banks in the wrong season. The grandeur and the misery are not opposites here, not arranged at a safe distance from each other. They are woven together, the gold thread and the grey thread pulled through the same fabric, inseparable, each one in some way requiring the other to exist in the form that it takes. The clerk would not be managing the accounts if someone else were not doing the labour. The Mayfair drawing room would not be warm if someone were not hauling the coal. What is perhaps most remarkable at the end of this long day is the resilience. Not the cheerful resilience that gets written about in certain kinds of history. The plucky working classes with their music halls and their community spirit. A resilience that is sometimes used to explain away the conditions that make it necessary. Something quieter than that. The woman who returns to the lodging house and sits by the range and waits for morning is not cheerful about it. She is simply continuing. The child who learns her letters in the crowded classroom is not unaware of the gap between what she is being told she might become and what she can see with her own eyes about what is likely. She is simply learning anyway. The man who walks 4 miles to work in the November dark because he cannot afford the omnibus is not grateful for the opportunity. He is cold, and his boots are not equal to the weather, and he will do it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until something changes, which it probably will not. This is what 1888 holds. This is why it stays with us. Because it is recent enough to be almost recognizable. The newspapers, the railways, the department stores, the sense of a world accelerating towards something. And distant enough to seem like another country, a place where the distances between lives were measured not in miles, but in something more fundamental and more fixed. We can almost touch it. We can read the letters, the diaries, the newspaper columns, the social surveys conducted by earnest men with notebooks, walking through the East End and recording what they found with the meticulous horror of witnesses who know that witnessing is the only instrument they have. We can walk the streets that still exist, stand on the bridges that were there, look at the river that is cleaner now and imagine it as it was. And there is the autumn of it, the particular autumn of 1888, with its specific freight of unresolved darkness. A city of 4.5 million people in which something was happening that no one could explain or stop. And the city went on regardless, as it had to, as it always does. That unresolved quality, that sense of a question left open in the dark, is part of why 1888 in particular lodges itself in the memory and does not quite leave. The gas burns down through the small hours. The smoke rises, the river moves. Somewhere a door closes softly. Somewhere a child turns in its sleep toward the warmth. The constable walks his long straight street, and his footsteps fade into the distances of the city, into all that accumulated fog and darkness and human breath, into the particular silence that is not silence but the sound of 4.5 million lives, each one private, each one continuing, each one carrying its own weight of ordinary endurance through another night in the greatest and most exhausting city in the world. Rest now. London will still be there in the morning.